I was raised as a ghost in the Kensington mansion, a servant to my brother Julian. I believed my servitude was the price for my existence until Julian's wedding. When the bride's father saw me, he dropped a $5,000 glass of wine. He did not look at me like a maid. He looked at me like he had seen a dead person walk again, and his shock was about to blow my family's lies apart. My name is Vivian Amberton. The green digital numbers on the industrial oven read 4:30 in the morning. Outside the frosted window panes, the streets of Beacon Hill were buried under a fresh layer of gray Boston slush. But inside the Kensington mansion, the air was already warm and smelled of lemon polish and old ambition. I did not need an alarm clock. My body had been calibrated to the rhythms of this house for 2 decades. Waking up precisely 1 hour before the heating system kicked into high gear and 3 hours before anyone with the last name Kensington opened their eyes. I placed my hands on the marble countertop. The stone was cold, biting into my palms. This was my domain, not the whole house, just the spaces that existed to serve the others. The kitchen, the laundry room, the narrow corridors behind the main halls. I moved with the practiced silence of a ghost. That was the first rule of survival here. Do not be heard. Do not be seen unless summoned. Be the invisible force that makes the silver shine and the coffee appear steaming hot in delicate china cups. Martha and Elias Kensington did not beat me. They were too civilized for that. Or perhaps they simply did not want to damage the merchandise. Instead, they used words. They constructed a reality where I was not a victim, but a debtor. Since I was 4 years old, the narrative had been drilled into my skull with the precision of a surgeon. They had saved me. They had plucked me from a tragic, unspecified fate and given me a roof over my head. My labor was not slavery. It was gratitude. It was restitution. You owe us your life. Vivian. The phrase echoed in my head as I began slicing grapefruits. The knife moved in a steady rhythm. The segments had to be perfect. No pith, no seeds, just the ruby-red flesh, arranged in a fan shape on the crystal plates. If I made a mistake, Martha would not yell. She would just look at me with a heavy, disappointed sigh and ask if this was how I repaid their generosity. That sigh was worse than a slap. It made my stomach twist with a guilt that I knew, intellectually, was manufactured. But emotionally, I could not shake. I walked up the back stairs to the 3rd floor. The house was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, all dark wood and high ceilings, designed to intimidate. My room was not part of the original design. It was a converted storage space in the attic, tucked behind the insulation of the master suite's walk-in closet. In the winter, I could see my breath in the air when I woke up. In the summer, it was a stifling oven. I passed the double doors of the master suite. Inside, Julian was sleeping. My brother, my tormentor, my job. Julian slept in a room with heated floors and Egyptian cotton sheets, with a thread count of 1,000. I slept on a cot with a mattress that sagged in the middle. We were the same age, 24, but our lives were 2 different species of existence. Julian was being groomed to rule the world, or at least Wall Street. I was being groomed to ensure his socks were matched and his ego was inflated. Technically, on paper, I was an employee. The Kensingtons had set up a shell company called Kensington Logistics. I was listed as an administrative assistant. It was a clever tax write-off for Elias, and a way to explain my presence to the few outsiders who asked. But I never saw a paycheck. My salary was deducted for rent, for food, for the clothes on my back, which were mostly Julian's cast-offs tailored to fit my smaller frame. Kensington Logistics was a farce. My real job title was everything. I was the maid, the cook, the personal shopper, and the secret brain behind Julian's mediocre academic success. I went back down to the study to collect Julian's briefcase. It was heavy with files he had not read. Last night, he had thrown a stack of market analysis reports on the kitchen table while I was scrubbing the grout. "Do this for me. Viv," he had said, not asking, just stating. "I'm too hungover to focus, and Dad wants a summary by 8. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning writing the summary. I absorbed the data, analyzed the trends, and wrote a concise 2-page report that made Julian sound like a prodigy. I slipped the report into his leather bag. This was the dynamic. I possessed the mind, but he possessed the name. I was the engine room, unseen and greasy. He was the shiny figurehead at the bow. By 6 o'clock, the breakfast table was set. The silverware was aligned with military precision. Elias came down first. He was a man who wore suits like armor, his face perpetually set in a grimace of important business. He did not say good morning. He simply snapped his newspaper open. I poured his coffee. Black, 2 sugars, no spills. Martha followed. She was still beautiful in a brittle, preserved way, like a flower pressed between the pages of a heavy book. She ran a finger along the edge of the dining table, checking for dust, finding none. She sat down. "Where is Julian?" she asked, her voice tight. "I will go wake him." "Madam," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. It was the voice of the servant, flat, subservient, devoid of the rage that boiled just beneath my ribs. I went up the main staircase this time. I knocked on Julian's door. No answer. I entered. The room smelled of stale scotch and expensive cologne. Julian was sprawled across the bed, tangled in the sheets. "Julian," I said, "it is 6:15. Father is waiting." He groaned and rolled over, peering at me with bleary eyes. His face was handsome in a soft, spoiled way. He looked like a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "Did you finish the report?" he mumbled. "It is in your bag," I replied. "I also ironed your navy suit. The gray one has a stain on the lapel you did not tell me about. You are a lifesaver. Viv." He yawned. Sitting up, "Seriously, I would be dead without you." He said it casually, like a joke. He did not know how true it was. He also did not know that Viv was a name I despised. It sounded like a pet, something small and obedient. While he showered, I laid out his clothes. I checked his phone, which was buzzing on the nightstand. A text message from a girl named Sophia. "I had a great time last night. Call me." Julian stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist. "Who is it?" he asked. "Sophia." I said, "She wants you to call." "Ugh," he grimaced, picking up his razor. "She is clingy. What should I say?" "Tell her you have a board meeting and you will call her this evening." I recited, knowing the script by heart. "Be charming but distant. Keep her wanting more. You are a genius." "Viv," he chuckled, "you should write a book on how to manipulate women." I stared at the back of his head. I did not need to write a book on manipulation. I was living in a master class taught by his parents. I went back downstairs to clear the kitchen. As I washed the pans, the hot water turned my skin red. I looked down at the back of my left hand. There was a scar there, a jagged white line about 2 inches long. It was from 3 years ago. I had been rushing to get a roast out of the oven for a dinner party. The heavy pan had slipped. The hot oil had splashed onto my hand. I remembered the searing pain, the smell of burning skin. I had dropped the pan, ruining the roast. Martha had come into the kitchen, not concerned about my hand, but furious about the meat. "Look what you have done," she had hissed. "My hand is burned," I had managed to say, tears streaming down my face. "I need a doctor." "Don't be dramatic." "Vivian," she had snapped, handing me a box of generic bandages. "It is just a blister. Put some ice on it and clean this mess up. We have guests arriving in 20 minutes. I had wrapped my hand in a towel and cleaned the floor on my hands and knees while the skin bubbled and peeled. It had taken weeks to heal. It had throbbed every night in the cold attic. I never saw a doctor. The scar was a permanent reminder of my place in the hierarchy. I was equipment. Equipment does not get sick leave. Equipment gets patched up and put back to work. But equipment does not think. That was their mistake. They assumed that because I was silent, I was empty. They did not know about the nights I spent stealing the Wi-Fi signal from the hallway. They did not know about the online courses I audited from MIT and Harvard, watching lectures with the volume turned down to 0, reading the closed captions. They did not know that I read every book Julian discarded. when he threw away his textbooks on macroeconomics or corporate law because they were boring. I rescued them from the recycling bin. I devoured them. I knew how to balance a ledger better than Elias. I knew more about market volatility than Julian. I spoke fluent French because I listened to audio lessons while I scrubbed the toilets. I was a sponge, soaking up every drop of information that fell from their table. I had to hide it. Of course. Intelligence in a servant is dangerous. If Martha knew I could understand the complex legal documents she left lying around, she would be terrified. She preferred to think of me as simple, hard-working. Yes, but simple. A sturdy mule. I finished the dishes and went to the laundry room to start the second load of the day. The hum of the washing machine was a comforting white noise. I allowed myself a moment to lean against the dryer and close my eyes. I was tired. I was always tired, but my mind was alert. I was waiting. I did not know what I was waiting for, but I knew I could not live like this forever. I was 24. The clock was ticking. That evening, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It was subtle, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Elias came home early. He was carrying a bottle of champagne, a vintage Krug that cost more than the collective value of everything I owned. Martha was wearing her best pearls. Julian was actually wearing the tie I had chosen for him, and he looked nervous. "Vivian," Martha called out. Her voice was sharp, high-pitched with excitement. "Set the table in the formal dining room, the good china, and use the crystal flutes. Is there a special occasion?" "Madam?" I asked, keeping my head lowered. "We are celebrating," Elias boomed, his face flushed with triumph. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, nearly knocking the boy over. "My son has finally done something right?" Julian grinned, a mixture of pride and relief. He looked like a dog that had finally managed to fetch the stick. I moved quickly, laying out the lace tablecloth. Positioning the silverware, I was invisible. Just a pair of hands arranging the stage for their victory. They sat down. I poured the champagne. The bubbles hissed in the silence. Elias raised his glass. "To Julian," he announced, "and to the future of the Kensington family." "To the future," Martha echoed, her eyes glittering. I stood by the sideboard, hands clasped behind my back, waiting to refill their glasses. I was part of the furniture. "I did it, Dad," Julian said, taking a large gulp of the wine. She said yes. Who said yes? I wondered. "Isabella," Elias said, savoring the name like it was a piece of prime steak. "Isabella Sterling." My breath hitched in my throat. I clamped my mouth shut to keep from making a sound. Isabella Sterling, the only daughter of Arthur Sterling, the heiress to Sterling Biotech, one of the largest pharmaceutical empires in the world. The Sterlings were American royalty. They were the kind of money that made the Kensingtons look like paupers. "She is completely in love with me," Julian bragged, leaning back in his chair. "She wants the wedding to be this summer, a June bride." "You have done well, son," Martha said. And for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. It was a predatory smile. "This is it. This is the golden ticket. Once you marry into that family, everything changes. No more scraping by, no more dealing with second-tier banks. We will be untouchable." I looked at them. I saw the greed radiating off them like heat waves. They did not care about Julian's happiness. They did not care about the girl. They saw Isabella Sterling as a bank vault that Julian had managed to crack open. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew Julian. I knew he was incapable of loving anyone other than himself. He was walking into a marriage with a lie on his lips, and his parents were cheering him on. "And what about the reception?" Martha asked, her mind already racing. "It has to be perfect. We need to impress Arthur Sterling. He's a difficult man. They say he is cold as ice." "I will handle Arthur," Elias said confidently. "We speak the same language, the language of success." I almost laughed. Elias spoke the language of desperation and leverage. Arthur Sterling spoke the language of power. They were not the same. "Vivian," Martha snapped, noticing my stillness, "refill the glasses. Don't just stand there dreaming." "Yes, madam," I said. I stepped forward and poured the champagne. The golden liquid swirled in the glass. As I looked at the bubbles rising to the surface, I realized that my life was about to become much more complicated. The Kensingtons were about to step onto a much larger stage, and they were dragging me with them. I did not know it then, but Isabella Sterling was not just a golden ticket for them. She was the key that would unlock the door to my own cage. The wedding of the century was coming, and the ghost of Kensington Mansion was about to become very visible indeed. The atmosphere inside the Kensington residence shifted from a low-level hum of ambition to the high-pitched shriek of desperate avarice. If the house had been a machine before, running on the fuel of Julian's minor successes, it was now a nuclear reactor operating at critical mass. The engagement was official. The ring, which Elias had purchased on credit from a jeweler who owed him a favor, was on Isabella Sterling's finger. Now came the hard part. The Kensingtons had to prove they belonged in a world where people did not look at price tags, while simultaneously checking their bank accounts to see if they could afford the gas to get there. I became the general of an army I was not allowed to join. Martha appointed me the head of logistics for the wedding, a title that sounded professional, but meant I was responsible for everything from sourcing out-of-season white hydrangeas to ensuring the toilet paper in the guest bathrooms was folded into perfect triangles. My workspace in the kitchen was buried under swatches of silk, samples of calligraphy, and seating charts that were revised every 3 hours. I spent 18 hours a day on the phone, negotiating with caterers who charged more for a single canapé than I would arguably earn in a lifetime of theoretical wages. One afternoon, while I was cross-referencing the dietary restrictions of 300 dignitaries, Martha breezed into the kitchen. She was holding the master guest list, a thick document printed on heavy cream paper. She dropped it on the counter next to my elbow. "Check this for spelling errors." "Vivian," she commanded, not looking at me as she adjusted her diamond earrings in the reflection of the microwave. "We cannot have the governor of Massachusetts seeing his name misspelled." I scanned the list. It was a roll call of the East Coast elite. Senators, CEOs, philanthropists. I ran my finger down the names, checking the Ks. Kensington, Elias, Kensington, Martha, Kensington, Julian. My finger hovered over the empty space where my name should have been. It was not a surprise. Of course, I knew my place, but seeing the physical absence of my identity on the paper was a sharp, cold pinch. I noticed I'm not on the list. "Madam," I said, keeping my voice neutral, "do you need me to coordinate the vendors from the service entrance on the day of?" Martha laughed, a dry, brittle sound like stepping on autumn leaves. "Oh, Vivian, do not be absurd. You are not a guest. Guests are people who contribute to the social fabric of the event. You are infrastructure. Besides, how would we explain you? A grown woman living in our attic who folds napkins. It would confuse people. No, you will be there. But you will be working. We need someone to manage the Sterling family's staff. They are bringing their own security and valets. You will interface with them. Wear your black uniform. The crisp one." She paused, leaning in closer, her expensive perfume cloying and sweet. "And wipe that sullen look off your face," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. If it were not for us, you would be rotting in a state penitentiary nursery, just another unwanted spawn of a criminal." This was their favorite weapon, the lie they had planted in my mind since I was old enough to understand language. They told me my biological parents were monsters, thieves, and murderers who had died in a shootout with police. They told me I had bad blood, and that only their strict discipline kept my inherent criminal nature at bay. I lowered my eyes. "Yes, madam," I said. "Good," she said, straightening up and patting her hair. "Now, fix the centerpiece for table 4. It looks lopsided." A week later, Isabella Sterling came to dinner. It was the first time she was visiting the Kensington territory. The house had been scrubbed within an inch of its life. We had rented art to hang on the walls, generic but expensive-looking landscapes to cover the faded spots where the wallpaper was peeling. When the doorbell rang, the air in the hallway practically vibrated. I stood in the shadows of the dining room archway, dressed in my black dress and white apron, hands clasped behind my back. Julian opened the door. Isabella stepped in. She was radiant. She did not have the sharp, manicured edges of the women Julian usually dated. She was softer, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuinely happy to see him. She wore a simple cashmere coat that probably cost $50,000, but she wore it casually, like it was a thrift store find. "Oh, Julian, your home is lovely," she said, her voice melodic and warm. Julian kissed her cheek, performing the role of the doting fiancé. "Welcome home, Bella. Come, meet my parents." Elias and Martha descended upon her like vultures spotting a wounded gazelle, all teeth and compliments. They ushered her into the living room, offering her drinks, asking about her father, laughing too loudly at her mild jokes. I moved forward to take her coat. Isabella turned, smiling at me, expecting perhaps a hired caterer. Then she paused. She looked at Julian, then at me, then back at Julian. "Oh, hello," she said to me. Then to Julian, she asked, "Is this your sister? You mentioned you had an adopted sister. Vivian, right?" The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt like an hour. Julian's smile froze. Martha's eyes narrowed into slits. I stood there, the coat heavy in my arms. I was wearing a maid's uniform. The cognitive dissonance was washing over Isabella's face. Why was his sister dressed like the help Julian recovered first? He let out a short, self-deprecating chuckle and wrapped an arm around Isabella's waist, steering her slightly away from me. "Yes, this is Vivian," he said, his voice dropping to a tone of mock sympathy. "But, darling, you have to understand, Vivian is special." "Special," Isabella repeated, confusion clouding her features. Julian tapped his temple significantly. "She has severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, specifically regarding cleanliness and service. She refuses to wear normal clothes. She insists on the uniform. It makes her feel safe. She gets very anxious if she's not cleaning or serving. We tried to stop her. Of course, we wanted her to go to college, to travel. But she just panics, so we let her do this. It is the only way she is happy." He looked at me with a sad, brotherly smile that made me want to drive a steak knife through his hand. "Right. Viv." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a new low, even for him. He had not just reduced me to a servant. He had reduced me to a mental patient. He had pathologized my slavery to explain it away to his wealthy fiancé. Martha chimed in, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "It has been a struggle for us, truly, but we love her, so we accommodate her needs. She simply hates social interaction." Isabella looked at me, her eyes filling with a mixture of pity and kindness. She stepped away from Julian and walked right up to me. She was close enough that I could smell her scent, fresh rain and expensive soap. "Hi, Vivian," she said softly, ignoring my uniform. "It is nice to meet you." I looked at Julian. His eyes were hard, warning me. I looked at Martha. She was touching her necklace, a silent signal that reminded me of the bad blood threat. "It is nice to meet you too, Miss Sterling," I said, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it was filled with broken glass. "May I take your coat?" Isabella hesitated, then slipped the coat off her shoulders. She handed it to me, but as the fabric passed between us, her fingers brushed mine. "Thank you," she said, "and please, call me Isabella." I retreated to the kitchen, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure rage against my ribs. I hung her coat on the rack and stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the industrial stove. They had erased me. They had rewritten my sanity to cover their tracks. Later that evening, a minor catastrophe occurred. Isabella snagged the hem of her silk dress on a loose nail in the dining room chair, a chair I had told Elias to replace 3 months ago. But he had been too cheap to buy a new one. The delicate fabric tore, a long, jagged rip right near the knee. Isabella gasped. "Oh no, my father gave me this dress." Martha looked ready to faint, not because of the dress, but because the imperfection might reflect poorly on their hosting. "Vivian," she shrieked, "bring the sewing kit." Immediately, I ran in with the basket. Isabella was sitting on the sofa, looking distressed. "I can fix it," I said quietly, "if you will allow me." Isabella nodded. "Please." I knelt on the floor at her feet. It was a humiliating posture, kneeling before the princess. But as soon as I threaded the needle, the world narrowed down to the task. I was good at this. I had mended Julian's suits, Martha's gowns, and the upholstery of the entire house for years. My hands moved with a speed and precision that was almost mechanical. I caught the frayed threads, wove them back together, and executed an invisible stitch that vanished into the weave of the silk. Within 10 minutes, the tear was gone. It was as if it had never happened. I bit the thread and looked up. Isabella was staring at me. But not with pity this time. She was looking at my hands. "That was incredible," she whispered. "I have seen professional tailors take a week to do what you just did in minutes. It is just practice." "Miss Isabella," I said. Standing up and smoothing my apron, she looked at me, really looked at me, searching for the crazy girl Julian had described. "You have such gentle hands," she said. "For someone who is supposed to be afraid of the world, you seem very steady." "Vivian." Before I could answer, Julian swooped in, grabbing Isabella's hand. "Amazing. Right. It is part of the obsession. She focuses on details. Come on, darling, dessert is served." He pulled her away, but Isabella glanced back at me one last time before disappearing into the dining room. That glance was the first crack in the wall they had built around me. She had seen a glimpse of competence, of reality, that did not fit the narrative. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, washing dishes that cost more than my life insurance policy. By 2 a.m, the house was quiet. Isabella had gone home. Julian was asleep, but Elias and Martha were still up. I was finishing the final wipe down of the counters when I heard their voices drifting from the library. The door was slightly ajar. I stopped. I knew I should keep moving, but the tone of their voices froze me. It was not the celebratory tone of earlier. It was low, urgent, and conspiratorial. I crept closer, standing in the shadow of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "We cannot wait until the wedding to ask for the loan," Elias was saying. His voice sounded thick, likely from the brandy. "The sharks are circling. Martha, I got a call today. They want the first installment of $200,000 by Friday, if I don't pay. They said they would break my legs. Or worse, they said they would pay a visit to the wedding." Martha hissed. "You idiot. You gambled it all away. We were supposed to use the refinancing money to pay for the catering. I thought I could double it." Elias whined. "I had a tip on a horse. It was a sure thing. There is no such thing as a sure thing, you fool." Martha spat. "Listen to me. We need to accelerate the timeline. Once they are married, our assets are linked. We can access the sterling lines of credit, but we need a bridge loan." "How?" Elias asked. "Arthur Sterling is not going to just hand us cash before the vows are exchanged. He is suspicious. I see the way he looks at me, like he smells something rotting." "We use the girl," Martha said. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Elias asked. "We tell Arthur that Vivian is sick," Martha said, her voice cold and calculating. "We tell him she needs a specialized treatment, a surgery, something expensive. We play on his sympathy. He is a philanthropist, right? He throws money at sick children. We tell him we are tapped out because we have spent everything on her care over the years. It makes us look like saints who sacrificed our fortune for an orphan, and it gets us the cash to pay off your thugs." Elias chuckled. "A wet, ugly sound. That is brilliant. And if he asks to see medical records, we forge them," Martha said dismissively. "Julian has a friend in medical billing. We get the money, pay the debt, and once the wedding happens, we tell Arthur she made a miraculous recovery, or that she died. It does not matter." I backed away, my hands trembling so hard I had to clasp them together to stop the shaking. They were not just parasites. They were cannibals. They were going to use my imaginary illness to swindle Arthur Sterling. They were going to monetize my existence one last time before discarding me. I retreated to my attic room, climbing the stairs on silent feet. I sat on the edge of my sagging mattress, staring at the moonlight filtering through the small round window. I had no power. I had no money. I had no friends. If I went to Arthur Sterling now and told him the truth, he would look at the maid with the mental illness and call security. Elias and Martha had insulated themselves perfectly with their lies, but as I sat there, replaying the conversation in my mind, a cold resolve settled in my chest. They wanted to use me as a prop in their grand play. Fine. I would be the best prop they had ever seen. I would play my part. I would be the silent, dutiful, obsessive servant. I would let them think they were pulling the strings. Because the thing about being invisible is that you see everything, and the thing about being a servant is that you have the keys to every door. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of deceit, and they had just invited a hurricane to the housewarming party. I lay back on the pillow, watching the dust motes dance in the moonlight. I did not sleep. I began to plan. If they wanted a tragedy, I would give them one, but the ending would not be the one they wrote. The convoy to Newport, Rhode Island, was a perfect visual metaphor for my life. The Kensingtons rode in a stretch limousine, a sleek black shark cutting through the highway traffic, stocked with chilled champagne and climate control set to a precise 70 degrees. I followed 200 yards behind them, driving a rented cargo truck that smelled of stale tobacco and burning transmission fluid. The truck was loaded with 20 crates of centerpieces, Julian's golf clubs, Martha's 5 suitcases of wardrobe changes, and the heavy silver candelabras they insisted on bringing because they did not trust the Sterling collection to be ostentatious enough. The suspension on the truck was shot. Every pothole on a 95 sent a shockwave up my spine, rattling my teeth. I had been driving for 3 hours. My shirt was sticking to my back, and my hands were cramping around the steering wheel. When the ocean finally came into view, gray and churning under an overcast sky, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Newport was not just a town. It was a fortress of old money. It was a place where names carried more weight than currency. The Sterling estate, known as the Breakwater, sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. As I turned the heavy truck through the wrought iron gates, the sheer scale of the place made the Kensington mansion in Boston look like a dollhouse. It was a sprawling limestone palace, built in the Gilded Age to mimic the chateaux of France. The driveway alone was 1/4 of a mile long, lined with manicured hedges that looked like they were trimmed with nail scissors. I pulled the truck around to the service entrance as instructed, while the limousine glided to the front portico to be greeted by a phalanx of staff. I spent the next 4 hours unloading the truck by myself. The humidity was suffocating. I hauled crate after crate into the service elevator, sweating through my uniform. No one offered to help. The Sterling staff were busy preparing for the arrival of the guests, and the Kensingtons were presumably upstairs, sipping iced tea and pretending they owned the place. When the last box was stacked in the storage room, Martha cornered me in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchens. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around as if the walls had ears. She grabbed my upper arm, her fingernails digging into the tender flesh. "Listen to me very carefully. Vivian," she whispered, her voice trembling with a manic intensity. "The rules have changed. This is not Boston. This is Arthur Sterling's territory. You are to be invisible. Do you understand? I understand?" "Madam," I said, trying to pull my arm away, but her grip tightened. "I am serious," she hissed. "You do not leave the service quarters unless you are moving equipment. You do not speak to the guests, and most importantly, you do not look at Arthur Sterling." "Why?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Because he is a dangerous man," she lied, her eyes wide. "He hates incompetence. If he sees a clumsy maid like you, he will have us all thrown out. If you see him coming, you turn around, you look at the floor, you hide. If you ruin this for Julian, I swear I will make you wish you had never been born." She released me with a shove and smoothed her dress. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the tile. It was a strange rule. I had been invisible my whole life, but this felt different. It was not just about social status, it was about concealment. She was terrified. I turned to go back to the kitchen and nearly collided with a wall of black wool. I gasped and stepped back. Standing there was the Sterling Estate's head butler. He was a man in his 60s, with posture so rigid he looked like he had a steel rod for a spine. He had silver hair and a face etched with the kind of dignity that comes from decades of silent observation. "I apologize, sir," I said, keeping my eyes lowered as instructed. "I was just—" He did not move. He was staring at me. I could feel his gaze burning into the top of my head. I risked a glance upward. He was looking at my face with an expression of profound confusion. His eyebrows were drawn together, and his mouth was slightly open. "Do I know you, miss?" he asked. His voice was deep and polished, like old oak. "No, sir," I said quickly. "I am with the Kensington family. I am their assistant." He tilted his head, his eyes searching my features. He looked at my hairline, my chin, and then he locked onto my eyes. For a second, the professional mask slipped. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Amberton," he murmured to himself. "That is the name on the roster. Vivian Amberton." "Yes, sir," I said, my heart hammering. "Is there a problem?" He blinked, shaking himself out of the trance. "No, no problem. You just remind me of someone who used to love this house very much." He cleared his throat and stepped aside. "Carry on, Miss Amberton." I hurried past him, my pulse racing. Who did I remind him of? The Kensingtons had told me my parents were nobodies, criminals from the gutter. But the way that butler had looked at me suggested a memory much softer than that. That night, the house settled into a heavy silence. The Kensingtons were staying in the East Wing guest suites. I was assigned a cot in the laundry room in the basement. It was damp and smelled of bleach. But I did not mind. It was quiet. I was just drifting off to sleep when the door banged open. Julian stood there, still in his dinner jacket, his tie undone, his hair a mess. He looked panic-stricken. "Wake up," he barked, flipping on the overhead fluorescent lights. I squinted against the glare. "What is it, Julian?" "The speech," he groaned, pacing the small room. "The rehearsal dinner speech. I forgot to write it. I thought I had it in my phone, but I was looking at the notes, and it is just a list of football scores." I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night. You have time." "I don't have time," he shouted, kicking a laundry basket. "We are going sailing with Arthur in the morning, then lunch at the club, then the dress fitting. I have zero time. You have to write it. Now," I asked. "It is 2 a.m. "Yes, now," he said, pulling a crumpled napkin out of his pocket. "Here, these are the bullet points. Mention how beautiful Isabella is. Mention how much I respect Arthur. Make a joke about how I am marrying up. But keep it classy. None of your weird poetry stuff. Just sound like a hedge fund guy who is deeply in love." He tossed the napkin onto my cot and turned to leave. "Julian," I called out. "What?" he snapped. "Do I get a thank you?" I asked quietly. He looked at me with genuine bewilderment. "You get a roof over your head. Viv, write the speech." He slammed the door. I sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the industrial dryer. Then I got up, found a notepad, and began to write. I wrote about love I had never felt. I wrote about a partnership I had never witnessed. I crafted sentences about destiny and commitment, weaving a beautiful lie for my brother to wear like a suit. I worked until the sun came up, my hand cramping, my eyes burning. At 7 o'clock, I found Julian in the breakfast room. He was eating eggs Benedict. I handed him the pages. He read them while chewing. He frowned. "Ephemeral," he said, pointing at a sentence with his fork. "What does that mean?" "It means lasting for a very short time," I said. "I was referring to the bachelor life you are leaving behind." "It sounds pretentious," he grumbled, "and this part about 2 souls anchoring each other in the storm. It is too heavy. I wanted funny. It is a wedding. Julian, not a roast," I said, fighting the urge to snatch the paper back. It is supposed to be sincere, whatever. He sighed, folding the paper and shoving it into his pocket. I will dumb it down on the fly. Thanks, I guess. He went back to his eggs. I went back to the shadows. Later that afternoon, I was carrying a stack of linens across the upper gallery when I saw him, Arthur Sterling. He was standing on the terrace below, overlooking the ocean. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy sweater and dark trousers. He was not surrounded by an entourage. He was completely alone. He held a glass of scotch in one hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just staring out at the gray water. From this distance, he did not look like the terrifying tycoon Martha described. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. There was a profound stillness about him, a melancholic gravity that pulled at something inside me. I watched him for a long time, wondering what he was thinking. Was he thinking about his daughter? Was he thinking about the wife he had lost? Suddenly, he turned his head, as if he felt eyes on him. I ducked behind a pillar, my heart racing. I remembered Martha's rule. Do not look at him. I waited until I heard the sliding glass door open and close below before I dared to move. The crisis struck at 5 o'clock. The welcome dinner was scheduled for 7. It was an intimate affair for 50 of the closest family and friends. The head stewardess, a woman named Maria who ran the dining room with an iron fist, collapsed in the pantry. It was a severe migraine, blinding and debilitating. She had to be taken to her quarters. The staff was thrown into chaos. They were short-handed. The agency had sent 2 servers who were stuck in traffic on the bridge. Martha found me in the kitchen, where I was polishing silverware. Her face was pale. "Put this on," she commanded, throwing a bundle of fabric at me. "What is it?" I asked. "It is a server's uniform," she said. "One of the girls is sick. The Sterling butler is demanding a replacement immediately. You have to fill in." "But the rule," I said. "You said I cannot be seen. You said, forget the rule," she snapped, her voice rising to a panic. "If the service is slow, Arthur will be furious. He hates bad service more than anything. We cannot afford a mistake tonight." She grabbed a black face mask from the counter the kind staff sometimes wore when they had a cold and shoved it into my hand. "Wear this," she ordered. "Tell them you have a slight cough and you are being responsible. Pull your hair back tight. Do not speak. Just pour the wine and clear the plates. Keep your head down. If Arthur looks at you, you turn away. Do you understand?" "But madam," I protested, terrifying dread pooling in my stomach. "If he sees me, he won't see you," she hissed. "To men like him, servers are furniture. You are just a pair of hands holding a bottle. Now go." I went to the locker room and changed. The uniform was stiff and smelled of starch. I pulled my hair back into a severe bun, pinning it so tight it hurt. I put on the black mask. It covered my nose and mouth, leaving only my eyes visible. I looked in the mirror. I looked like a shadow, a generic, faceless servant. I walked out into the dining room. The guests were beginning to arrive. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. I saw Julian laughing with a group of young men near the bar. I saw Elias trying to corner a senator near the fireplace, and then I saw Arthur Sterling enter. The room seemed to tilt toward him. Conversation stopped. He walked with a quiet power, nodding to guests but rarely smiling. He took his seat at the head of the long table. I was assigned to his section. My hands were shaking as I picked up the bottle of red wine, a Chateau Margaux that cost $5,000 a bottle. I wrapped a white napkin around the neck of the bottle. "Breathe, Vivian," I told myself. "You are invisible. You are just infrastructure." I moved toward the head of the table. Arthur was talking to Isabella, who sat on his right. He was smiling at her, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his face. I stepped up to his left side. "Wine." "Sir," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He did not look up. He just nodded slightly. Continuing his conversation, I leaned in to pour. The ruby liquid flowed into the crystal goblet. I focused entirely on the stream, terrified of spilling a single drop, and then it happened. A guest across the table, a loud man with a booming laugh, gestured wildly with his hand. He knocked over a salt shaker. It clattered loudly against a porcelain plate. Arthur stopped talking. He turned his head sharply toward the noise. In that split second, as I was lifting the bottle away, our eyes met. I was wearing a mask. My hair was pulled back. I was dressed as a servant. But my eyes, my gray, distinctive eyes, were exposed. Arthur froze. The smile vanished from his face. His pupils dilated. He did not blink. He stared right into my eyes, and I saw a spark of recognition ignite in his gaze that was so intense it felt like a physical blow. He did not see a waitress. He did not see a stranger. For the first time in 22 years, Arthur Sterling was looking at a ghost, and the bottle of wine in my hand suddenly felt as heavy as a bomb. The welcome dinner was a masterclass in excess. The Sterling Estates ballroom had been transformed into a cavern of golden light and white orchids. 3 enormous crystal chandeliers hung from the frescoed ceiling, casting a warm, flattering glow over the 50 guests who represented the combined GDP of a small European nation. I moved through the room like a shadow. My presence acknowledged only by the empty glasses thrust in my direction or the dirty napkins dropped onto my tray. The black face mask Martha had forced me to wear was stifling. It was made of thick cotton, and in the humidity of the crowded room, it felt like a muzzle. It clung to my skin, trapping my breath and the heat of my own anxiety. I felt like a thief in a bank vault, surrounded by treasures I was forbidden to touch. Waiting for the alarm to sound, I circulated the room with a silver tray of hors d'oeuvre caviar on blinis that cost more per ounce than the entire contents of my wardrobe. As I wove between the clusters of guests, I became an unwilling eavesdropper to the chorus of high society. They did not lower their voices when I passed. Why would they? One does not whisper in front of a vacuum cleaner or a lampstand. "Did you hear about the merger?" a woman in emerald silk asked, her voice shrill with excitement. "The stock is going to skyrocket once the vows are exchanged. Julian Kensington must have been born under a lucky star." A man replied, swirling his whiskey, "He is inheriting the keys to the kingdom. I heard Arthur is giving him a seat on the board immediately." "A seat on the board?" The woman laughed. "He is getting the whole empire eventually. Arthur has no other heirs. It is a tragedy about his wife and the other child. Of course, but it worked out rather well for the Kensingtons." I gripped the silver tray tighter, my knuckles turning white. They spoke of the tragedy that had decimated the Sterling family as if it were a fortunate business transaction. They spoke of Julian as if he were a prince, not a parasite who had needed his sister to write his rehearsal speech on a napkin. I saw Julian across the room. He was holding court near the grand piano, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of champagne. He looked the part. He was laughing at something the governor was saying, his head thrown back in a display of easy charm. Martha and Elias were flanking him, beaming like proud architects admiring a completed skyscraper. They had done it. They had successfully sold the lie. I turned away, feeling a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the smell of the truffled risotto. I needed to refill the water pitchers. I headed toward the service station located in a small alcove near the French doors that led to the terrace. As I passed a group of young men friends of Julian from his prep school days, one of them stumbled. He was red-faced and loud, clearly having taken full advantage of the open bar. He swung his arm out to emphasize a joke, and his hand collided heavily with my shoulder. I lost my balance. The tray in my hand tipped. But worse, the glass of red wine in his other hand went flying. It was a direct hit. The dark crimson liquid splashed across my chest and up onto my neck and face. The fabric of my mask soaked it up instantly, turning into a wet, suffocating rag against my mouth and nose. "Oh, watch it," the man snapped, looking at his own cuff which had a single drop on it. "You should be more careful." "I apologize, sir." I mumbled, the wine dripping down my chin. I could not breathe. The wine-soaked mask was clinging to my nostrils, filling my lungs with the sharp, acidic scent of fermented grapes. I felt panic rising in my chest, a primal, claustrophobic need for air. I hurried into the semi-darkness of the alcove. It was a small transition space between the ballroom and the library. Furnished with an antique console table and a large, gilded mirror, it was quiet here, shielded from the main party by a heavy velvet curtain. I set the tray down on the console table with trembling hands. I reached up and unhooked the loops of the mask from my ears. I pulled it off, gasping for air. The cool air hitting my damp skin was a relief. I grabbed a clean linen napkin from my pocket and began to frantically wipe the wine from my face. I scrubbed at my cheek, my chin, my neck. I looked into the mirror. My face was flushed, my hair slightly disarrayed from the mask strap. The wine had left a faint stain on my skin. Like a bruise, I was so focused on cleaning myself, on erasing the evidence of the mishap so I could put the mask back on and disappear, that I did not hear the footsteps approaching on the thick Persian rug. "I just need a moment of peace," a deep, weary voice said from the doorway. I froze. The napkin hovered over my cheek. I turned my head slowly. Arthur Sterling was standing there. He had clearly stepped into the alcove to escape the noise of the party he was paying for. He looked exhausted. His tie loosened slightly, a glass of water in his hand. He was looking down at the floor, rubbing his temple with his free hand. "I am sorry, sir," I said, my voice shaking. "I had a spill. I will leave immediately." Arthur looked up. The lighting in the alcove was dim, provided by a single crystal sconce on the wall. But as I turned to face him, the light caught the side of my face. It illuminated the sharp line of my jaw, the curve of my nose, and the high arch of my cheekbones. Arthur stopped. He did not just stop walking. He stopped existing in the present moment. His entire body went rigid, as if he had been struck by lightning. The glass of water slipped from his fingers. It did not fall in slow motion. It fell fast and hard. It hit the marble floor with a violence that shattered the silence. The sound of exploding crystal was like a gunshot. Shards of glass skittered across the floor, and water pooled around his expensive leather shoes. But Arthur did not look down. He did not flinch. He did not seem to hear the noise at all. His eyes were locked on my face. His mouth opened slightly, his breath hitching in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the marble beneath our feet. He took a step toward me, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Evelyn," he whispered. The name hung in the air, heavy with 22 years of grief. It was not a question asked of a stranger. It was a plea to a ghost. I stepped back, pressing myself against the console table. I was terrified. Martha's warning screamed in my head. He is a dangerous man. But he did not look dangerous. He looked broken. "Sir," I stammered, holding the napkin against my chest like a shield. I am not." He took another step. He was close now, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray in his beard. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. He looked as if he wanted to touch my face to see if I was real, but he was afraid his hand would pass right through me. "Evelyn," he said again, his voice cracking. "You came back." The crash had attracted attention. The velvet curtain was swept aside. "What happened?" A voice boomed. It was Elias. And right behind him was Martha. They stopped dead when they saw the scene. The broken glass. The water. Arthur Sterling reaching out to the servant girl who was not wearing her mask. Martha's face went through a kaleidoscope of expressions, confusion, realization, and then sheer, unadulterated terror. She lunged forward, placing herself physically between me and Arthur. "Oh, Mr. Sterling," she cried, her voice high and shrill. "I am so sorry. This clumsy girl." She dropped a glass. "She is so clumsy. Vivian, get back to the kitchen immediately." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in like talons, trying to drag me away. Arthur roared. "Stop." The word was not loud, but it carried such authority that Martha froze instantly. She let go of my arm as if it burned her. Arthur did not look at her. He stepped around her, closing the distance between us. He was ignoring the guests who were now crowding the doorway, whispering and pointing. He was ignoring Elias, who was sweating profusely and tugging at his collar. Arthur looked at me. He looked at my forehead, my nose, my mouth, and then he looked into my eyes. I stared back at him, unable to look away. I saw his gaze lock onto my irises. My eyes were a peculiar shade of gray ash gray with a ring of darker charcoal around the pupil. I had always hated them because they were so different from everyone else's. Martha had brown eyes, Julian had blue, Elias had hazel. Arthur's eyes were the exact same shade of gray. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He brought his hands up to his face, rubbing his eyes hard, then looked at me again. "You are not Evelyn," he murmured, his voice gaining a terrifying clarity. "Evelyn is dead." "No, sir," I whispered. "My name is Vivian. Vivian Amberton. Vivian." He repeated the name, tasting it. He looked at Martha, then back at me. Martha intervened again, desperation making her reckless. "Arthur, please, you are tired. It has been a long day. The wine maybe you have had too much. This girl is just our charity case. She is nobody. She just looks a bit generic." "Generic," Arthur said. He turned his head slowly to look at Martha. The grief in his face was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp. "You think those eyes are generic, Mrs. Kensington?" he asked softly. Martha opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Arthur turned back to me. He did not touch me, but his gaze felt like a physical embrace. He studied me with the intensity of a scientist looking at a miracle, or a detective looking at a smoking gun. "Turn your head," he commanded. I hesitated. "Turn your head. Please," he said, softer this time. "To the left." I turned my head to the left, exposing my profile to the light again. I heard him inhale sharply. "It is impossible," he whispered to himself, "but it is right there. The nose, the chin." He looked down at my hands. He saw the scar on my left hand, the burn from the oil. His eyes narrowed. "Who are your parents?" "Vivian," he asked. "I don't have parents." "Sir," I said, tears pricking my eyes. "The Kensingtons raised me." Arthur looked at Elias. Elias was looking at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. "I see," Arthur said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. He straightened up. He adjusted his cuffs. The mask of the billionaire host slid back into place, but it did not fit as well as it had before. There were cracks in it now, and through the cracks, a fire was burning. I apologized for the disturbance. "Everyone," Arthur announced to the room. Though he never took his eyes off me, a glass slipped. "It happens. Please, go back to your dinner." He signaled to the butler, the man with the steel spine who had seen me earlier. "Simmons," Arthur said. "Yes." "Gag," the butler replied. Stepping forward, "Please escort Miss Amberton. Please escort Miss Amberton to the guest quarters in the West Wing." Martha gasped. "The West Wing? But that is for VIPs. She stays in the servants' quarters." "Not tonight," Arthur said. He looked at Martha with a look of pure loathing that made her shrink back. "Tonight, she is my guest. She looks shaken. I want her to rest. But who will serve the dessert?" Martha protested weakly. "I think we can manage without her." Arthur said. He turned to me. His eyes were still searching, still questioning. But there was a flicker of something else there, too. Protection. "Go with Simmons. Vivian," he said. "We will talk later." I nodded, too stunned to speak. I followed the butler out of the alcove, away from the broken glass and the spilled water. As I walked away, I could feel the eyes of the entire room boring into my back, but the heaviest gaze was Arthur Sterling's. I glanced back once before I turned the corner. Arthur was not looking at his guests. He was not looking at the Kensingtons. He was standing in the middle of the broken glass, watching me leave. He took out his phone and dialed a number. Lifting it to his ear, the party continued. The music swelled, and the laughter resumed. But the air in the room had changed. The ghost had been seen, and the master of the house had just realized that the ghost looked exactly like the woman he had buried 22 years ago. The illusion of being a guest in the West Wing lasted exactly 14 minutes. That was how long it took for Mr. Simmons, the butler with the steel spine, to leave me in the blue velvet armchair with a glass of water and a promise to return with a doctor. The door clicked shut, the heavy oak engaging with the frame. I let out a breath I had been holding for 20 years. The room smelled of lavender and sea salt. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe. Then the service door, hidden in the wainscoting near the bathroom, burst open. It was not a doctor, it was Martha. She did not look like the polished socialite anymore. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. She crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing a handful of my hair before I could even stand up. "You stupid, ungrateful girl," she hissed. Yanking me out of the chair, I cried out, stumbling, "Madam, Mr. Sterling said Mr. Sterling is drunk." She spat, dragging me toward the hidden door. "He is a grieving old man who saw a ghost in the bottom of a wine bottle. And you opportunistic little parasite, you stood there and let him look at you." She pulled me into the narrow service corridor that ran behind the guest suites. The walls here were unpainted concrete, the lighting harsh and fluorescent. It was the veins of the house, the ugly infrastructure that pumped life into the luxury on the other side. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to pry her fingers off my arm. "Where you belong," she said. She marched me down 3 flights of stairs, past the kitchens, past the laundry, into a storage room that smelled of damp cardboard and floor wax. She shoved me inside. The room was barely 6 feet wide, filled with stacks of extra chairs and boxes of cleaning supplies. "You stay here," she commanded, breathing hard. "You do not come out. You do not speak to anyone. If Arthur asks, you went home sick. If you try to leave this room, Vivian, I swear I will tell the police about the jewelry I planted in your mattress back in Boston. You will go to prison, and no billionaire's pity will save you." She slammed the door. I heard the lock turn. I sat on a stack of folded tablecloths, pulling my knees to my chest. My cheek still stung where the mask had rubbed against it, but the pain in my chest was worse. For a moment, upstairs, I had felt seen. Now, I was back in the dark. But something had changed. The fear that usually paralyzed me was being replaced by a cold, vibrating curiosity. Martha was not just angry. She was terrified. Why, if I was just a nobody? Just a charity case? Why did my face make Arthur Sterling drop a glass? And why did it make Martha Kensington look like she was staring at her own executioner? I did not know that 3 floors above me. The machinery of my liberation had already been switched on. I could not see Arthur Sterling sitting in his study. The lights dimmed, a bottle of scotch unopened on his desk. I could not hear him on the secure line with the head of his private intelligence firm, a man who usually handled corporate espionage and hostile takeovers. "I want a full background check on the Kensington girl," Arthur was saying, his voice steady but his hand gripping the phone so tight his knuckles were white. "Vivian Amberton. Find out where she was born. Find out where they found her. And dig into Elias and Martha Kensington's history, specifically the year 2004. I did not know that while I shivered in the dark. Arthur was opening a physical file that he kept in a safe behind a painting, a file he had not opened in 2 decades. Inside were the police reports, the grainy photos of the twisted metal of a black sedan, the death certificate of Evelyn Sterling, and the missing person report for Victoria Sterling. Age 2, presumed dead, body displaced by the river current, and I certainly did not know the detail that made Arthur's blood run cold as he scanned the old witness statements. The statement from the family's au pair, a young woman who had been let go 2 weeks before the accident for petty theft, but who had been seen near the estate on the day of the crash. Her name was Martha, but the Martha Kensington sleeping in the guest room down the hall looked nothing like the grainy photo of the au pair in the file. The nose was different. The chin was sharper. The cheekbones were higher. Plastic surgery could do wonders in 20 years, especially if one wanted to erase a past identity. I sat in the storage room until my legs went numb. Sometime around 4 in the morning. The lock clicked. I stiffened, expecting Martha. But the door just opened a crack. No one entered. I waited. Silence. I pushed the door open. The hallway was empty. Someone, perhaps Simmons. Perhaps a sympathetic maid had unlocked it. I did not question my luck. I needed to be working. If I was working, I was invisible. If I was invisible, I was safe. I crept into the main kitchen. It was empty, the stainless steel appliances gleaming under the low security lights. I went to the coffee station and began to brew the first pot of the day, a dark roast that the chef preferred. I was reaching for the sugar canister when a voice spoke from the shadows of the breakfast nook. "You are up early." I spun around, nearly dropping the spoon. Arthur Sterling was sitting at the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. He was wearing a silk robe over his clothes, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 100 years. On the table in front of him was a tablet, its screen glowing with documents I could not read from this distance. "Mr. Sterling," I gasped, bowing my head. "I apologize. I did not know you were here." He waved a hand dismissively. "It is my kitchen. Vivian, I suppose I'm allowed to be in it?" He stood up and walked toward the counter. He moved slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. In the harsh kitchen light, I saw the red rims around his irises. He looked at me not with the shock of the previous night, but with a forensic intensity. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I lied. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I had just brewed. He took a sip. "Black. No sugar. Tell me." "Vivian," he said, leaning his hip against the counter. "What is your earliest memory?" The question was so unexpected, so intimate, that I blinked. My memory. "Sir, yes. Do you remember your parents? Your real parents?" I shook my head. "No." "Sir." "Martha, Mrs. Kensington told me I was in an accident when I was very young. I suffered trauma. My memory is blank before the age of 3 or 4. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. "An accident. Did she say what kind of accident? A car accident?" She said my parents were running from the police. They crashed. I was the only survivor." Arthur set the coffee cup down. The ceramic made a sharp click against the granite. "A car accident," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That is a very convenient narrative." He took a step closer to me. The smell of his cologne sandalwood and old tobacco was overwhelming. "And Mrs. Kensington," he continued, "has she always looked the way she does now?" I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Sir." "Has she had work done?" he asked bluntly. "Surgery." "To change her face?" I hesitated. I knew the answer. I had seen the scars behind Martha's ears when I brushed her hair. I had seen the old photos she kept hidden in the bottom of her jewelry box. Photos of a woman with a wider nose and a softer chin. "She cares a great deal about her appearance," I said carefully. "She visits a clinic in Switzerland every few years. She says it is for maintenance." Arthur nodded slowly. It was a microscopic movement, but it felt like a gavel coming down. "Switzerland," he murmured. "Excellent place to disappear for a few weeks." He reached out, his hand hovering near my face again. I flinched, expecting a blow. He stopped, his hand freezing in midair. "I am not going to hurt you, Vivian," he said softly. "I just have a scar. On your temple, under the hairline." My hand flew to the spot. There was a tiny white line there, hidden by my hair. I had always assumed it was from a childhood fall. "How did you know that?" I whispered. "Because my daughter fell off a swing when she was 2 years old," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "She needed 3 stitches. I held her hand while the doctor did it. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with those gray eyes." The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Was he implying, before I could ask? The kitchen door swung open. Vivian Julian marched in. He was wearing a bathrobe and looked hungover and irritable. He stopped when he saw Arthur, his face transforming instantly from anger to obsequious charm. "Oh, Arthur," he said, smoothing his hair. "Good morning. I didn't expect to find you slumming it with the help." Arthur did not smile. He turned his gaze from me to Julian. It was like watching a lion turn its attention from a cub to a hyena. "I was getting coffee." "Julian," Arthur said coldly, "since your sister seems to be the only one awake to make it." Julian laughed nervously. "Right. Vivian is a machine. She runs on batteries. I swear." He turned to me, his smile dropping. "Viv, I need my gray suit pressed. I spilled scotch on it last night. And make me a Bloody Mary. Spicy. I have a headache that could kill a horse. I have not finished the breakfast prep." "Julian," I said, glancing at Arthur. "I don't care about the breakfast prep." Julian snapped. "Stepping into my personal space, I care about looking good for the press photos at 10. Go do it. Now." He poked me in the shoulder with a hard, sharp finger. It was a gesture of ownership, a reminder of who held the leash. I saw Arthur's hand clench into a fist on the countertop. The veins in his forearm bulged. For a second, I thought he was going to hit Julian. "Is there a problem?" Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. Julian jumped. "No, no problem. Just you know how it is. You have to be firm with them, or they get lazy. Vivian knows the drill." Arthur looked at Julian with an expression of profound disgust. "Yes," he said, "I see the drill quite clearly." He turned back to me. His eyes were soft again. "Go. Vivian," he said, "press his suit. We will finish our conversation later." I nodded and fled the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the door. As I walked down the hallway toward the laundry room, my mind was racing. My daughter fell off a swing. "You have a scar on your temple." I touched the scar again. It was real. The memory was gone. But the mark remained. Why would Arthur Sterling lie? He had everything. He had no reason to invent a story about a dead daughter in a swing set. Unless it wasn't a story. I thought about the bad blood Martha always talked about. I thought about the photos of the car crash she had shown me once to scare me straight. I thought about the way she looked at Arthur last night, not with the reverence of a social climber, but with the terror of a fugitive. I entered the laundry room and turned on the iron. The steam hissed, rising up in a white cloud. "I am not a servant," I whispered to the empty room. The words felt strange in my mouth. Dangerous. I looked at the pile of Julian's clothes. For the first time in my life, I did not see them as my duty. I saw them as evidence. Evidence of a crime that had been happening for 22 years. I needed proof. Arthur had his files, but I had access to something he did not. I had access to Martha's luggage, and Martha never traveled without her lockbox, a heavy, metal makeup case that she claimed held her expensive jewelry, but which she kept under her bed and never opened in front of anyone. If the truth was anywhere, it was in that box. I pressed the iron down onto Julian's suit. Watching the steam rise, the heat was intense. Arthur Sterling had started a fire in the kitchen, and I was about to burn the Kensington house down with it. The silence in my head was louder than the chaos of the wedding preparations. For 24 years, I had accepted the boundaries of my world as the necessary walls of a prison designed to keep a dangerous animal inside. That animal was me. Martha had told me that my blood was tainted, that my biological parents were addicts and thieves, and that I carried their genetic predisposition for destruction. That was why I was not allowed to have a social media account. That was why I was forbidden from submitting my photo to the high school yearbook. That was why, when I won a full scholarship to an art program in Paris at the age of 19, Martha had burned the acceptance letter in the kitchen sink while I watched, sobbing. "You cannot have a passport, Vivian," she had said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "If you apply for a passport, the government will run a background check. They will see who your father was. They will come for you. We are protecting you from the sins of your past." I had believed her. I had believed that my anonymity was a shield. But as I stood in the staff bathroom of the Sterling estate, staring at my reflection in the polished mirror, the truth settled over me like a shroud of ice. It was not a shield. It was a blindfold. They had not been hiding the government from me. They had been hiding me from the world. They were terrified that one day a camera lens or a facial recognition algorithm would catch the angle of my jaw and flag a ghost that was supposed to be dead. I picked up my hairbrush from the marble vanity. It was full of loose strands my hair had been thinning from the stress of the last few weeks. I began to pull the strands out, rolling them into a ball to throw away. "Leave it." The voice came from the doorway. I jumped, dropping the brush. Simmons, the Sterling butler, was standing there. He was not looking at me with the disdain that most senior staff reserved for temporary help. He was looking at the hairbrush on the floor with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I was just cleaning it, Mr. Simmons," I stammered. "Leave it," he repeated. Stepping into the small room, he produced a small, sterile plastic bag from his pocket, the kind used for evidence. He knelt down, his knees cracking slightly, and picked up the brush. He did not hand it back to me. He slipped it carefully into the bag and sealed it. "Mr. Sterling requests this," he said simply. My hand went to my throat. "Why?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Simmons looked at me. For a brief second, the professional mask slipped, and I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Science is a patient man, Miss Amberton," he said. "But Mr. Sterling is not. The helicopter is waiting on the south lawn to take this to the Sterling Biotech Labs in Boston. We will have an answer in 24 hours. He turned and left. I stood frozen in the bathroom. 24 hours. That was the countdown. In one day, my DNA would be stripped down, analyzed, and compared to a ghost. The abstraction of my identity was about to become biological fact, but the world did not stop for my existential crisis. The wedding machine ground on. That evening, Julian decided to host an impromptu bachelor party in the estate's game room. It was not the official party that had happened in Vegas 2 weeks ago, but Julian was bored and nervous, a combination that always resulted in destruction. He invited his groomsmen and half the male guests under the age of 40. By midnight, the game room was a war zone. Expensive scotch flowed like tap water. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air, choking the ventilation system. Vivian Julian's voice boomed over the thumping bass of the music system. I hurried in from the hallway, carrying a bucket of ice. The room smelled of testosterone and spilled alcohol. Julian was holding court at the billiards table, his tie tied around his head like a bandana. His face flushed with drink. "We need more limes," he shouted, gesturing vaguely at the bar. "And clean up that mess over there." Mike threw up. He pointed to a priceless Persian rug in the corner. I looked at him. This man was about to marry Isabella Sterling. He was about to inherit an empire, and he was standing there, a petty tyrant king of a pile of filth, barking orders at the sister he had enslaved. I did as I was told. I cleaned the rug. I cut the limes. I served the drinks. I let them ignore me. I let them treat me like a Roomba with a heartbeat, because every minute they spent drinking was a minute they were not watching me. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the party had devolved into a stupor. Julian was passed out on a leather sofa. The guards were stationed outside, but they were relaxed. Thinking the threat was external, I slipped out of the game room. I did not go to the kitchen. I did not go to the laundry room. I went to the east wing. The hallway was silent. The carpet swallowed my footsteps. I reached the door of the suite Martha and Elias were sharing. I pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear Elias snoring, a rhythmic, rattling sound that I had heard through the thin walls of my attic room for years. But I did not hear Martha. Martha was a light sleeper. But she was also a creature of habit. She took a sleeping pill every night before a big event. She called it her beauty rest. If she had taken it at 11, she would be in a chemical coma right now. I turned the handle, locked. I reached into my apron pocket. I did not have a key, but I had a straightened hairpin. I had learned how to pick the cheap locks in the Kensington house when I was 12, mostly to steal food from the pantry when they sent me to bed without dinner. The lock on the Sterling guest suite was more sophisticated, but Elias had left the key in the lock on the inside, a careless habit. I slid a piece of stiff paper under the door. I used the pin to push the key out from the other side. It fell onto the paper with a soft thud. I pulled the paper back. I had the key. I opened the door and slipped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Martha and Elias were two lumps in the king-sized bed. I crept across the floor on my hands and knees. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Martha never traveled without her carry-on case. It was a hard-shell vintage Louis Vuitton, battered and scratched. She never checked it. She never let the porters carry it. She claimed it contained her jewelry and her medication. I found it shoved under the side of the bed where she slept. I pulled it out, inch by inch, holding my breath every time the wheels squeaked. I dragged it into the walk-in closet and closed the door, leaving just a sliver of light. The case was locked with a combination. I stared at the 3 dials. Martha was not a creative woman. She was sentimental about her own grievances. I tried the date of her wedding. No. I tried Julian's birthday. No. Then I remembered. The day they got me. The day their lives changed. April 4th. 0404. The lock clicked. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would wake them up. I opened the lid. There were no diamonds. There were no pearls. The box was filled with paper. I reached in and pulled out a handful of clippings. They were old, yellowed, and brittle. They smelled of mildew and time. I held them up to the sliver of light. They were newspaper cuttings from the Providence Journal, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times. The headline on the first one read, "Tragedy on Route 9. Sterling heiress killed in crash." I shuffled to the next one. "Search for missing toddler called off after 3 weeks." And then I found the photograph. It was clipped from a society page, dated 1 month before the crash. It showed a woman standing in a garden, holding a toddler on her hip. The woman was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair catching the sunlight. I stopped breathing. I was looking at myself. The woman in the photo was not just similar to me. She was me. The curve of the eyebrows, the shape of the mouth, the way her hairline peaked in the center, it was the face I saw in the mirror every morning. But without the exhaustion, without the fear, this woman was radiant. I looked at the caption, "Evelyn Sterling and her daughter, Victoria, at the Newport Garden Gala." I dropped the paper. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I was not a monster. I was not the daughter of junkies. I was Victoria Sterling. I was the baby in that picture. I dug deeper into the box. I found a birth certificate, Victoria Evelyn Sterling, born March 12, 2002. And then, at the bottom, I found a diary. It was a cheap spiral notebook. I opened it. The handwriting was Martha's spiky and aggressive. October 14th, 2004. The plan worked. The driver was drunk. He didn't even see the tree. Evelyn is gone. The chaos was perfect. I grabbed the kid. Nobody saw. We are leaving for Boston tonight. Elias is terrified. But he knows we need the money. We will raise her. We will make her serve us. It is poetic justice. The Sterlings have everything. Now, their princess will scrub my floors. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. It wasn't just a kidnapping. It was an act of vengeance. They had stolen me not out of love, not even just for ransom, but to punish a family they envied. They had turned the heiress into a slave to feed their own sick sense of superiority. I heard the closet door creak. I spun around. Martha was standing there. She was wearing her silk nightgown. Her face was covered in a thick layer of night cream, making her look like a phantom. She was not holding a weapon, but the look in her eyes was more dangerous than a knife. She did not scream. She did not call for Elias. She just stepped into the closet and closed the door behind her, sealing us in the dark. "So," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep and malice, "you found it." I scrambled backward, clutching the diary to my chest. "You stole me." Martha laughed. It was a low, dry sound. "Stole you, I saved you. Your mother was a useless socialite who didn't know how to change a diaper. She was dead the moment that car hit the tree. You were just debris. Vivian, I picked you up. I gave you a purpose. You made me a slave. I hissed, finding a voice I didn't know I had. You lied to me. You said my parents were criminals. They were, Martha said, stepping closer. In a way, rich people are the biggest criminals of all. They hoard the world while people like us starve. I just took a little back. She reached out a hand. Give me the book. Vivian. No, I said. Martha's face twisted. She slapped me. It wasn't a hard slap, but it was dismissive. It was the way one slaps a disobedient dog. You think you are one of them? She sneered. You think because you saw a picture, you are suddenly royalty. Look at you. You are wearing a maid's uniform. You have rough hands. You smell like floor wax. You are nothing. Vivian, you are what I made you. You are a servant. That is your DNA now. You couldn't be a Sterling if you tried. You are too broken. She loomed over me, using the psychological weight she had built up over 20 years. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to apologize, to hand over the book, to beg for forgiveness. That was the script. That was how the play always went. But as I looked up at her, watching the moonlight catch the grease on her face, I felt something snap inside me. It was the chain, the heavy, invisible chain that had tethered my soul to her approval shattered. I touched my cheek where she had slapped me. It didn't hurt. It felt distant. I stood up. I was taller than her. I had never realized that before because I had spent my whole life slouching, trying to be small. But now, I straightened my spine. I am not Vivian, I said. My voice was quiet, but it was steady. It did not shake. Martha blinked, taking a step back. What did you say? I said I am not Vivian. I repeated, and I am not broken. I am just waiting. Waiting for what? She spat, though her voice wavered for the first time. I looked her dead in the eye, the gray sterling eyes that she had tried to hide for 2 decades. I am waiting for the sun to come up, Martha, because when it does, the shadows disappear, and you are nothing but a shadow. I shoved past her. I didn't run. I walked. I walked out of the closet, out of the bedroom, past the sleeping form of the man who had driven the getaway car. I walked out into the hallway with the diary tucked into my waistband. Martha didn't follow me. She stood in the closet, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the object she owned had just become a person. I went back to the laundry room. I did not sleep. I sat on the dryer, watching the window, waiting for the dawn. I knew Simmons had sent the hair sample. I knew the clock was ticking, but I didn't need a lab report to tell me who I was anymore. I knew, and God help the Kensingtons when the rest of the world found out. The sun rose over Newport with a cruel, golden brilliance, illuminating the white tents and the thousands of flowers that had been arranged to celebrate a crime. I was back in the scullery, the lowest circle of the estate's culinary hell, standing ankle-deep in soapy water. Martha had confiscated the diary. She had taken it from me before dawn when she found me in the laundry room, snatching it back with a violence that left bruises on my wrists. She had burned it in the incinerator while I watched, her eyes manic and triumphant. "You have no proof," she had sneered. "You are just a tired girl with a vivid imagination. Now get to work." She had forced me into the oldest, most ragged uniform she could find, a gray dress that was 2 sizes too big, intended to make me look shapeless and pathetic. I was assigned to the pot washing station, hidden behind a wall of stainless steel shelves, far away from the eyes of the guests. But while I was scrubbing the burnt remains of the breakfast service, 3 floors above me, the truth was arriving at the speed of light. At exactly 9 o'clock, Arthur Sterling's personal tablet chimed in his study. It was a secure email from the head of genetics at Sterling Biotech. The subject line was a single word: priority. I did not see this happen. Of course, I learned of these details later, from the legal depositions and the police reports that I would memorize like scripture. But in my mind, I can see it as clearly as if I were standing in the room. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk. He opened the file. He did not scroll. He did not need to. The summary was right at the top, bold and undeniable. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Conclusion, positive match. Arthur did not cry. He did not scream. He stared at the numbers until they burned into his retinas. Vivian Amberton was not a stranger. She was not a charity case. She was Victoria Sterling. She was the daughter he had mourned for 8,000 days. But the file contained more than just biology. It contained the background check Arthur had ordered on the Kensingtons. The private investigator had dug deep, past the fake smiles and the credit card debt, back to the year 2004. Arthur read the profile of a woman named Martha Higgins. She was not a nanny. She had never been a nanny. She was a cocktail waitress who had been in a tumultuous, obsessive relationship with a man named Carl Vance. Carl Vance was the chauffeur who had been driving the Sterling family car on the night of the accident. Arthur's hands began to shake. Not with grief, but with a cold, homicidal rage. The police report from the accident stated that Carl Vance had been drunk. He had died on impact, along with Evelyn, but the investigator's notes suggested a darker narrative. Martha had been furious that Carl was trying to leave her. She had threatened him. She had been seen near the crash site. Arthur connected the dots with the precision of a master tactician. Martha had not found a baby by the riverbank. She had been there. She had likely followed the car, and when the world ended in twisted metal and fire, she had seen an opportunity. She had not saved the child out of mercy. She had stolen the child to punish the man who died, and the family he worked for. She had taken the Sterling heiress and turned her into a slave to pay for the sins of a poverty she despised. It was a crime of such staggering cruelty that it almost defied belief. She had raised the victim to serve the kidnapper. Arthur stood up. He walked to the window and looked down at the lawn, where the guests were beginning to arrive. He saw Elias Kensington shaking hands with a senator, laughing, playing the role of the father of the groom. Arthur did not reach for the gun he kept in his safe. That would be too easy. That would be too quick. He was a businessman. He understood leverage. He understood that to truly destroy an enemy, you do not just kill them, you dismantle their entire reality in front of an audience. He picked up his phone and dialed the private number of the state police chief. "This is Arthur Sterling," he said. His voice was devoid of any human warmth. "I need you at my estate in 1 hour. Bring a federal warrant, and bring your best men, but tell them to wear suits. I do not want sirens. Not yet." He made a second call to his personal attorney. "Bring the papers," Arthur said, "and bring the modification to the will. We are going to have a signing ceremony down in the kitchen." The air was thick with steam and the smell of roasting lamb. My hands were raw and red from the steel wool. I was scrubbing a copper pot that was larger than my torso. My back ached, and my eyes were dry and burning from lack of sleep. I could hear the music drifting in from the garden. A string quartet was playing Vivaldi. It sounded like a mockery. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open. The chatter of the chefs died down. Isabella Sterling walked in. She was wearing her wedding dress. It was a cloud of white lace and silk, costing more than the house the Kensingtons lived in. She looked breathtaking, like a fairy tale princess, but her face was pale and her hands were trembling. "Miss Isabella," the head chef stammered, "you should not be back here. The ceremony is starting in 30 minutes. "I need water," Isabella said, her voice thin. "I just need a moment away from the cameras. Please." She walked past the stunned cooks, heading toward the quiet corner where the dishwashing station was located. She did not see me at first. I was hunched over the sink, trying to make myself small, but then she stopped. She looked at the gray dress. She looked at the soapy water. She looked at my face. "Vivian." She breathed. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my apron. I could not bow to her. Not today. "Hello?" "Isabella," I said. "What are you doing?" she asked, her eyes wide with horror. "Why are you washing dishes? You are Julian's sister. You should be in the front row." "I am not his sister." "Isabella," I said quietly, "I am his servant. That is all I have ever been." Isabella shook her head, confusion warring with the narrative she had been fed. "But Julian said he said you liked this. He said it was your condition. Julian is a liar. I stepped closer to her. I smelled her expensive perfume, the scent of a life I should have had. Isabella. Listen to me, I said, my voice urgent. Do not marry him. Isabella took a step back, clutching her bouquet. What, he does not love you? I said, he loves the access. He loves the portfolio. He loves the idea of being Arthur Sterling's son-in-law. I heard them talking, Elias and Martha. They are broke. Isabella. They are drowning in debt. They are using you as a lifeline. Vivian. Stop, Isabella whispered, tears filling her eyes. You are just upset. Julian loves me. He told you what you wanted to hear. I interrupted. Just like he told you I was crazy. Just like he told you I chose to live in the attic. Look at me. Isabella, really look at me. Does this look like a choice? I held out my raw, blistered hands. Isabella looked at them. She looked at the scars. She looked at the exhaustion etched into my skin. The cognitive dissonance was cracking. She was a smart girl. Deep down, she knew something was wrong. She knew that the Kensingtons were too eager, too smooth, too hungry. I don't know what to believe. She stammered. Believe your eyes. I said, walk away, please, before it is too late. Before she could answer, the service door banged open. There you are. Julian stormed into the kitchen. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but his face was twisted with irritation. Bella, what the hell are you doing? The photographer is waiting. My parents are freaking out. He marched over and grabbed Isabella's arm. His grip was not gentle. It was possessive. I was just getting water, Isabella said, looking from him to me. Julian. Vivian says. Don't listen to her, Julian snapped, cutting her off. He glared at me with pure venom. What did you tell her? You little psycho. He hissed at me. I stood my ground. I told her the truth. Julian laughed. A harsh, barking sound. The truth. You don't know what the truth is. You are having an episode. Viv. He turned to Isabella, his voice softening instantly into that fake, honeyed tone he used so well. Baby, look at her. She is off her meds. She gets paranoid when she is stressed. She is jealous. She has always been jealous of me, and now she is jealous of you. She wants to ruin our big day because she cannot handle seeing us happy. Isabella looked at me. I stood there in my rags, holding a scouring pad. I looked crazy. I looked like the villain in their perfect romance. Isabella, please, I said. Julian pulled her away. Come on, we are leaving. And you? He pointed a finger at me. Stay here. If I see your face outside this kitchen, I will have you committed to a psych ward before the honeymoon is over. Do you hear me? He dragged Isabella out of the kitchen. She looked back at me once. Her eyes filled with fear and confusion, but she let him lead her away. The door swung shut. I stood alone in the silence of the scullery. I had failed. The wedding would go on. The trap would snap shut on Isabella, and the Kensingtons would win. But I was wrong. I did not know that in the security office adjacent to the main library, Arthur Sterling was standing in front of a bank of monitors. He was watching the feed from camera 4, the kitchen camera. He had seen everything. He had seen Isabella enter. He had seen me warn her. He had seen Julian storm in. And he had seen Julian grab Isabella's arm. Arthur watched the screen with a terrifying stillness. He saw the way Julian manhandled his daughter, his biological daughter and his adopted daughter, both victims of the same parasite. He heard the audio feed. Clear and crisp. You little psycho. You are having an episode. Arthur watched Julian drag Isabella out. He looked at the image of me, standing alone by the sink, defeated. My head bowed. Arthur reached out and touched the screen, his finger tracing the outline of my face. Enough, he whispered. He turned to the chief of police, who was standing in the shadows of the room, adjusting his tie. Did you see that? Arthur asked. I did. Mr. Sterling, the chief replied. That is assault and coercion. That is just the appetizer, Arthur said. He checked his watch. It was 10 minutes to the ceremony. "Let them start," Arthur said. "Let them get to the altar. Let them think they have won. I want them to taste the victory. I want them to feel the champagne on their tongues." He buttoned his jacket, his face set into a mask of stone. "And then," Arthur said, "I want to burn their world to the ground." He walked out of the security room. He did not go to the garden to give the bride away. He went to the kitchen. I was startled when the door opened again. I thought it was Julian coming back to punish me. But it was Arthur. He was alone. He walked straight up to me, ignoring the dirty water on the floor. "Come with me." "Vivian," he said. I looked at him, confused. "Sir, the wedding." "The wedding is a stage," Arthur said, "and we are rewriting the final act." He reached out and took my hand. His grip was warm and solid. It was the grip of a father. "Leave the apron," he commanded. "But I am not dressed," I stammered, looking down at my gray rags. "It does not matter what you wear," Arthur Sterling said, looking into my eyes with a ferocity that took my breath away. "You are a Sterling. You could wear a trash bag, and you would still outshine every person in that garden." He pulled me toward the door. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To take back what is yours," he said. And as we walked out of the service entrance, hand in hand, I realized that the silence was over. The ghost was stepping into the light, and the sound of the collision was going to be deafening. The ceremony was staged on the great lawn, a stretch of manicured emerald grass that ended abruptly at the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It was a setting that screamed old money, the kind of aggressive, effortless beauty that made you feel grateful just to be allowed to breathe the same salty air. White silk tents billowed in the gentle breeze, and thousands of white hydrangeas had been imported from Holland that very morning to line the aisle. It was the perfect backdrop for a fairy tale. Or in this case, the perfect crime. I was not scrubbing pots anymore. I was standing behind the towering French doors of the main conservatory, hidden from view but able to see everything through the glass panes. I was no longer wearing the gray rags of a servant. I was wearing a gown that felt like water against my skin. It was midnight blue, the color of the deep ocean, made of heavy silk that draped over my frame and pooled around my feet. It had been Arthur's wife's dress, a vintage piece from a Paris collection 30 years ago. Yet it fitted me as if it had been stitched onto my body. Arthur had left me there with Simmons, the butler, while he went to play his part. "Wait for the signal," Arthur had told me. "When the doors open. You do not walk, you glide. You are not a guest. You are the owner of this house returning home." I watched through the glass as the guests took their seats. They were a sea of pastel linen suits and designer hats, the elite of New England society. I saw senators, judges, and captains of industry. They were all smiling, oblivious to the fact that they were sitting in the blast zone of a bomb that was about to detonate. Julian stood at the altar. He looked magnificent. I had to admit, the tailored tuxedo hid the softness of his character, and the ocean breeze caught his hair just right. He looked like the prince of the world. I watched him lean toward Elias, who was standing beside him as the best man, a role usually reserved for a brother or a friend. But Julian had neither, only accomplices. I could not hear them through the glass, but I knew exactly what they were saying. I had spent a lifetime reading their lips and their body language. I saw the way Julian's eyes darted over the crowd, counting the net worth of the attendees. I saw the predatory grin he flashed at his father. "After today, we will own half this state," Julian whispered. I saw his lips form the words perfectly. Elias chuckled, patting his son on the back. He looked sweaty despite the cool breeze. He was nervous. He kept touching his jacket pocket, where I knew he kept his flask. He was a man who had bet everything on a single horse, and he was terrified the animal would break a leg before the finish line. In the front row, Martha sat alone. She was performing the role of her life. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sniffing delicately, she looked the picture of the proud, emotional mother. overwhelmed by the joy of seeing her son marry into American royalty. She was wearing a dress of champagne gold, trying to blend in with the Sterlings, trying to look like she belonged. But from where I stood, she looked sharp and jagged, a piece of costume jewelry trying to pass as a diamond. Then the music changed. The string quartet shifted from a light prelude to the heavy, resonant chords of the wedding march. The guests stood up, all heads turned toward the back of the aisle. Arthur Sterling appeared. He was walking with Isabella. Isabella looked like a porcelain doll that was about to shatter. Her face was pale, her makeup unable to hide the redness around her eyes from where she had been crying in the kitchen. She held her father's arm not out of tradition, but for support, as if she might collapse without him. Arthur, by contrast, was a tower of calm. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. He was not smiling. His face was a mask of terrifying neutrality. He did not look like a father giving his daughter away. He looked like a general marching a prisoner to a tribunal. They reached the altar. The music faded into the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. Julian stepped forward, flashing his brightest, most winning smile, the smile that had charmed investors and seduced Isabella. He reached out to take Isabella's hand, but Arthur did not let go. I pressed my hand against the glass door. This was it. Arthur held Isabella's hand tight against his side. With his other hand, he reached out and gripped Julian's extended hand. It was supposed to be a handshake, a symbolic transfer of responsibility. But Arthur did not shake it. He squeezed it. I saw Julian's smile falter. I saw him wince slightly. Arthur was a strong man, a man who chopped wood on his weekends to clear his mind. He was crushing the bones of Julian's hand. The silence stretched too long. It became awkward. The guests began to shift in their seats. Arthur leaned in close to Julian. The microphones picked up nothing, but the silence of the crowd was so absolute that his voice carried on the wind. "Are you sure you deserve my daughter, son?" It was a question that could have been interpreted as a father's protective joke, a standard warning to the groom, but the tone was wrong. It was cold. It was flat. It was a threat. Julian laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that cracked in the middle. "Of course, Dad," he stammered. "I will take care of her. I promise." Arthur stared at him for a second longer, a second that must have felt like an eternity to Julian. Then, slowly, he released Julian's hand. He did not step back to his seat in the front row. Instead, he remained standing on the altar. Positioning himself between the couple and the officiant, he turned to face the audience. The officiant, a confused bishop who had performed Sterling weddings for 40 years, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling," he whispered, "please take your seat." Arthur ignored him. He looked out at the hundreds of faces staring back at him. He looked at the cameras that were broadcasting the event to the local news stations. "We have a tradition in the Sterling family," Arthur said, his voice booming without the aid of a microphone. "We believe that a marriage is not just a union of two people, but a union of truth. We do not build our houses on sand, and we do not build our families on lies." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not in the program. Martha stopped dabbing her eyes. She froze, the handkerchief hovering in midair. Elias unbuttoned his jacket, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Arthur continued, his voice rising with the wind. "Today, I was prepared to give my daughter to this man. I was prepared to welcome the Kensington family into my home, but the ocean has a way of washing up things we thought were lost. It has a way of returning what was stolen." He raised his hand and pointed directly at the conservatory doors. "Directly at me. Simmons," Arthur commanded. "Open the doors." Simmons, who was standing beside me, nodded solemnly. He pressed the release mechanism. The heavy glass doors swung open. The sound of the ocean rushed into the conservatory. Mixing with the sudden gasp of 300 people, I stepped out. The sunlight hit me like a physical blow. The blue silk of my dress caught the light, shimmering like the surface of the sea. My hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, was loose, cascading over my shoulders in dark waves. I was wearing the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Evelyn Sterling, a piece of jewelry so iconic that it had been featured in magazines 3 decades ago. I did not look at the ground. I did not hunch my shoulders. I walked with the chin-up defiance that Arthur had ordered. I walked onto the grass. The reaction was instantaneous. It started as a ripple of confusion and swelled into a tidal wave of shock. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the wooden flooring of the deck. Whispers turned into shouts. My God! A woman in the 3rd row screamed, "It is Evelyn! It's a ghost!" Someone else shouted. I walked down the aisle. The path was long, lined with those white hydrangeas. Every step I took felt like I was crushing the 20 years of servitude beneath my heels. I saw the faces of the people who had ignored me at the party the night before. I saw the man who had spilled wine on me. His mouth was hanging open, his eyes bulging. He did not see a servant girl. He saw a resurrection. But my eyes were locked on the altar. I saw Julian. His face had gone completely white, the color of paper. He looked like he was about to vomit. He took a step back, stumbling, his heel catching on the hem of Isabella's dress. I saw Isabella. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of realization, not sorrow. She looked from me to the portrait of her late mother that stood on an easel near the altar. And the connection was electric. And then, there was Martha. She was the only one who moved. She stood up so fast her chair fell over backward with a loud clatter. Her face was not pale. It was purple. The veins in her neck were bulging. The mask of the benevolent matriarch had completely disintegrated, revealing the feral, cornered animal underneath. She stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked. Her voice was unrecognizable, a guttural, demonic screech that silenced the wind. "Get out!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the gate. "You filthy little wretch! Get back to the kitchen! You are ruining everything!" She lunged at me. It was a mistake. In the world of the Kensington house, she was the master and I was the slave. But we were not in the Kensington house. We were on Sterling ground. 2 large men in dark suits. Arthur's private security detail materialized from the crowd. They did not grab her gently. They intercepted her with the efficiency of linebackers. One of them caught her arm mid-swing, twisting it behind her back. "Let go of me," she howled, thrashing against them. "Do you know who I am? I am the mother of the groom, no." Arthur's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He stepped down from the altar. Walking toward us, the crowd parted for him. He came to stand beside me. He put an arm around my shoulder, pulling me close. It was the first time a father had held me in my entire life. "You are not the mother of the groom, Mrs. Kensington," Arthur said, his voice cold and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are a kidnapper." He looked at the crowd, his gray eyes blazing. "And this," he said, tightening his grip on my shoulder, "this is not your servant." He paused, letting the silence build until it was unbearable. "This is Victoria Sterling, my daughter, and she has come home." The silence broke. It shattered into 1,000 pieces as the police sirens finally began to wail in the distance, getting louder and louder, closing in on the beautiful, terrible lie. Julian sank to his knees, burying his head in his hands. Elias tried to run toward the beach but tripped over his own feet, and Martha just screamed, a long, wordless sound of pure hatred as she stared at the girl in the blue dress who had finally stopped being invisible. Arthur Sterling did not shout. He did not need to. He held the microphone with the casual confidence of a man who owned the airwaves, the electricity, and the very ground beneath our feet. The wind whipping off the Atlantic Ocean seemed to die down, as if nature itself was pausing to listen to the verdict. He stepped to the center of the altar, overshadowing the trembling figure of Julian Kensington. The bishop scurried away like a frightened mouse. Arthur looked out at the sea of white faces, the senators, the bankers, the socialites who had spent the last decade whispering about the tragedy of the Sterling line. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I apologize for the interruption. We gathered here today to witness a union, to celebrate the joining of two families. But I have always believed that a wedding is, at its core, about truth." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over Elias and Martha, who were currently being restrained by security guards near the front row. "And today is indeed a day of celebration," Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming rich with dangerous emotion, but not for a marriage. "Today is the day I recovered a treasure that was stolen from me 8,035 days ago." He raised a small remote control in his hand and pointed it at the massive LED screen set up behind the altar. It was intended to play a montage of Julian and Isabella's courtship, a saccharine collection of staged photos set to pop music. Arthur pressed the button. The screen flickered, but instead of a picture of Julian smiling on a sailboat, a document appeared. It was high definition, crisp, and undeniable. It was a DNA analysis report from the Sterling Biotech Laboratories. The crowd squinted against the sunlight. Then, a collective gasp ripped through the audience like a physical wave. The numbers were magnified in bold red font. Subject A, Arthur Sterling. Subject B, Vivian Amberton. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. Arthur turned to look at the screen, then back to the audience. "Please allow me to reintroduce the young woman standing beside me," Arthur said. "You may know her as the maid. You may know her as the quiet girl who refilled your wine or scrubbed your floors, but that was a lie constructed by the people sitting in the front row." He gestured to me. "This is not Vivian Amberton. This is Victoria Sterling, my daughter, the rightful heir to the Sterling legacy. And for 22 years, she has been held captive, brainwashed, and enslaved by Elias and Martha Kensington." The word enslaved hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Before the shock could fully settle, the sound of the ocean was drowned out by a mechanical scream. From the long, winding driveway of the estate, a convoy of black SUVs tore across the grass, shredding the manicured lawn. Blue and red lights flashed, blindingly bright even in the afternoon sun. The sirens wailed, a chaotic symphony of justice that sent the seagulls scattering into the sky. State troopers in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles. They did not look like the polite security guards usually seen at Newport weddings. They carried assault rifles. They moved with military precision. The guests screamed and scrambled out of their chairs, knocking over the white hydrangeas. Trampling the silk runners, the illusion of civilized society evaporated in seconds. The police swarmed the altar. Julian Kensington, who had been standing frozen like a statue, suddenly snapped out of his trance. He looked at the police, then at his parents, then at the furious face of Arthur Sterling. The survival instinct of a cockroach kicked in. He lunged toward Isabella, grabbing her hands. She flinched, pulling back, but he held on tight, his face slick with sweat and terror. "Bella, baby, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know it was them." He pointed a shaking finger at Elias and Martha, who were being handcuffed by 3 officers. "My parents are monsters," Julian shouted, tears streaming down his face. "They told me she was adopted. They told me she was crazy. I am a victim too." "Bella, you have to believe me. I love you. I would never hurt you." Isabella looked at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with horror and confusion. For a second, just a split second, I saw her waver. Julian was a master manipulator. He had spent years perfecting the art of the innocent charm. Arthur Sterling saw it too. He did not step in physically. He simply pressed the button on the remote again. The DNA report on the screen vanished. It was replaced by a video file. The date stamp was from 3 months ago. The location was the Kensington living room. The audio boomed over the speakers, crisp and clear. It was Julian's voice, but it was not the voice of the frightened groom. It was the voice of a predator. "Look, Mom, I don't care where you get the money," the Julian on the recording sneered. "Sell the jewelry. Sell the car. But I need $50,000 by Friday for the Vegas trip. Then, Martha's voice. We don't have it. Julian, we are tapped out until the wedding. And then, the nail in the coffin. Then maybe I should tell Arthur Sterling about the girl in the attic. Julian's voice said, laughing cruelly, I mean, come on. She looks exactly like his dead wife. If I drop a hint to the tabloids, this whole charade blows up. So pay up, or I start talking. The recording ended. The silence on the lawn was absolute. The only sound was the clicking of the handcuffs on Elias's wrists. Julian released Isabella's hands as if they had turned into hot coals. He backed away, shaking his head. That is fake, he stammered. That is AI. That is not me. Isabella stared at him. The love in her eyes didn't just die. It was incinerated. It was replaced by a look of such profound revulsion that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Isabella took a step forward. She was trembling, but her hand was steady. She raised her hand and struck him. It was not a slap. It was a punch, delivered with all the betrayal and rage of a woman who realizes she has been sleeping next to a viper. The sound of her palm connecting with his jaw cracked like a whip. Julian stumbled back, clutching his face. Monster. Isabella screamed. Her voice was raw, tearing at her throat. You knew. You made me laugh at her. You made me pity her. You knew who she was the whole time. She ripped the 10-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was a Sterling family heirloom that Arthur had allowed Julian to use. She threw it at him. It hit him in the chest and bounced onto the grass. Get away from me, she shrieked. Do not ever say my name again. 2 officers grabbed Julian. He did not fight. He collapsed, his legs giving way, turning into a sobbing mess of black tuxedo and shattered ego. But the chaos was not over. Martha Kensington, seeing her son destroyed, seeing her golden ticket ripped to shreds, finally let the mask fall completely. She let out a sound that was not human. It was the screech of a banshee. She bit the hand of the officer restraining her, sinking her teeth into his forearm. The officer yelled and loosened his grip. Martha broke free. She did not run for the exit. She did not run for her husband. She ran for me. Her face was twisted into a rictus of pure hate. Her makeup was smeared, her hair wild. She looked exactly like the woman described in the old police reports, Martha Higgins. The desperate, violent cocktail waitress. You ungrateful little brat, she screamed, charging up the aisle. I should have drowned you in the river when I had the chance. I gave you a life. I put clothes on your back. You belong to me. She reached into her purse, which she had somehow held on to, and pulled out a steak knife she must have stolen from the reception tables. The crowd screamed. Arthur stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body. But he didn't need to. Before she could get within 10 feet of the altar, a blur of motion intercepted her. It was Simmons, the 60-year-old butler. He moved with a speed that defied his age. He tackled Martha, driving his shoulder into her midsection. They hit the ground hard. The knife skittered across the wooden planks of the deck. Martha thrashed and clawed, spitting obscenities that made the high society guests cover their children's ears. She was cursing my mother, cursing Arthur, cursing the unfairness of a world that refused to let her win. 3 more officers piled onto her, pinning her to the ground. They zip-tied her hands behind her back and hauled her to her feet. She stood there, panting, her expensive gold dress stained with grass and dirt. She looked at me, her eyes burning with madness. Tell them, Vivian, she shrieked. Tell them how I took care of you. Tell them you would be nothing without me. Arthur stepped aside, allowing me to see her. The lawn fell silent again. The police held their positions. The guests watched, terrified and mesmerized. I looked at Martha. I looked at Elias, who was weeping silently into his chest. I looked at Julian, who was curled up in the fetal position for 20 years. I had been afraid of these people. I had jumped when they called. I had trembled when they frowned. I had let them define my reality, my worth, and my name. But as I stood there in my mother's blue dress, with the ocean wind in my hair and my father by my side, I realized something. They were small. They were so incredibly small. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to scream or slap them. I felt a cold, distant pity, the kind you feel for a rabid dog that has to be put down. I walked down the steps of the altar until I was standing right in front of Martha. I was close enough to smell the fear on her, sour and pungent beneath her perfume. Martha stopped screaming. She looked at me, waiting for me to break. Waiting for the old Vivian to apologize. I looked her in the eye. "You did not raise me, Martha," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You did not feed me out of love. You did not clothe me out of charity." I leaned in closer. "You were just the storage facility. You were holding on to stolen property because you knew, deep down, that you could never afford the real thing." Martha flinched as if I had hit her. "You thought I was your servant," I continued. "But I was never your servant. I was your retirement plan. I was your leverage. I was the only thing of value in your entire pathetic life." I straightened up and looked at the police officer holding her arm. "Get them out of my sight," I said. It was not a request. It was a command. It was the voice of a sterling. The officers nodded. They dragged the Kensingtons away. Martha began to scream again, incoherent ravings about money and injustice, but her voice faded as they shoved her into the back of a squad car. I stood there, watching the flashing lights recede down the driveway. The spell was broken. The monster was in a cage. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned. Isabella was standing there. Her face was a ruin of mascara and tears, but she was looking at me with a fierce intensity. "I am so sorry," she whispered. I shook my head. "Do not be sorry. Isabella, just be glad you didn't sign the marriage license." She let out a choked laugh that turned into a sob. She reached out and hugged me. It was a desperate, clinging hug. Arthur joined us. He wrapped his massive arms around both of us, creating a fortress against the staring crowd. "Let's go home." "Dad," I said. The word felt strange on my tongue. "Dad." Arthur looked at me, tears finally spilling over onto his cheeks. "Yes, Victoria," he said. "Let's go home." We turned our backs on the ruined wedding, on the shocked guests, and on the shattered remains of the Kensington lies. We walked back toward the great stone house on the cliff, leaving the empty white tent flapping in the wind like a flag of surrender. The nightmare was over. The waking up had just begun. The gavel did not sound like a thunderclap. It sounded like a dry, wooden period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse in Boston, my hands folded in my lap. I was wearing a cream-colored suit, tailored to within a millimeter of perfection. Arthur sat on my right, his presence a warm, solid wall against the media frenzy that buzzed behind the barricades. Isabella sat on my left, her head held high, no longer the weeping bride but a witness to justice. We watched as Elias and Martha Kensington stood before the judge. They did not look like the social climbers who had nearly conned their way into the Sterling dynasty. They looked shrunken. The orange jumpsuits washed out their complexions, revealing the grayness of their souls. The charges were a laundry list of human depravity, kidnapping, human trafficking, identity fraud, forgery, and the cherry on top, the financial crimes. The forensic accountants Arthur had hired found that Elias had not only planned to embezzle from the Sterling fortune, but he had already siphoned off nearly $200,000 from the wedding budget into an offshore account. Greed, in the end, was the only language they spoke fluently. The judge was a woman with eyes like flint. She looked at Martha, who was still trying to sob, still trying to play the victim card she had used for 20 years. "Martha Kensington," the judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "You stole a child. You stole a life. You stole a mother from her daughter and a daughter from her father, and you did it not out of desperation, but out of spite. There is no parole for the kind of darkness you carry. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole." Martha screamed. It was the same banshee wail she had released at the wedding. But here, in the sterile air of justice, it sounded pathetic. The bailiffs dragged her away. She looked at me one last time, her eyes pleading, begging for the girl she had raised to intervene. I looked back at her. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply watched her disappear through the side door. Feeling absolutely nothing, the cord was cut. Elias received the same sentence. He collapsed, weeping into his hands, blaming Martha, blaming Julian, blaming everyone but himself. And then, there was Julian. He stood alone. His lawyer had tried to argue that he was a victim of his parents' manipulation, that he was just a child when the kidnapping occurred. But the prosecution had the tapes. They had the recordings of him blackmailing his parents. They had the witness testimonies of how he treated me. Julian did not get life. He got 15 years in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy, accessory to kidnapping, and extortion. 15 years. He would be 40 years old when he saw the sky as a free man again. He would lose the prime of his life. He would lose his looks. He would lose the future he felt entitled to. As they led him away, he looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. He mouthed the word Vivian, a silent plea. I turned my head and looked at the flag behind the judge's bench. Julian Kensington no longer existed in my world. But punishment is not just about time served, it is about the quality of that time. Arthur made sure I knew what happened to them. He didn't tell me with glee, but with a grim sense of closure, in prison. Julian was not a prince. He was not a Wall Street prodigy. He was soft. He was entitled. And in the brutal ecosystem of the cell block, those were weaknesses that were exploited mercilessly. The man who had thrown his dry cleaning at my head because a button was loose was now assigned to the prison laundry detail. He spent 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, sorting through the soiled, sweating uniforms of 2,000 inmates. He scrubbed stains, he folded sheets. He was shouted at by guards who cared nothing for his last name. He had become the servant. The irony was so precise it felt scripted by a higher power. He was living the life he had forced onto me, but without the hope of a wedding day to save him. As for me, the world expected me to become Victoria Sterling. The papers called me the lost heiress. They wanted me to erase the last 2 decades, to pretend Vivian Amberton had never existed. They wanted me to step into the shoes of the toddler who had vanished, but I could not do that. I sat with Arthur in his study one evening, a week after the trial. The fire was crackling in the hearth. We were drinking tea. He remembered that I hated coffee, a detail he had learned and filed away with the reverence of a religious text. I cannot be just Victoria, I said, staring at the flames. Victoria is the girl who fell off the swing. Victoria is the ghost. But the woman who survived Martha, the woman who learned to pick locks, who learned to run a household on a shoestring budget, who learned to read people's intentions before they even spoke, that woman is Vivian. Arthur set his cup down. He looked at me with that intense, gray-eyed gaze that mirrored my own. So, who do you want to be? He asked. I want to be Vivian Sterling. I said, I want to keep the name. It reminds me of what I survived. It reminds me that I didn't just inherit this life, I earned it. Arthur smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. Vivian Sterling. He tested the weight of it. It sounds strong. It sounds like a woman I would not want to cross. We spent the next year crossing the globe. I did not go back to school immediately. I had spent my life studying in secret. Now, I wanted to learn in the open, but more than that, I needed to learn how to be a daughter. We went to Paris, we walked along the Seine, and Arthur told me stories about my mother, how she laughed, how she argued, how she loved bad romance novels. We went to Tokyo, we sat in quiet gardens, and I told him about the books I had read, the dreams I had stifled, the anger I had swallowed. It was not always easy. There were days when the trauma resurfaced, when I flinched because he raised a hand to hail a taxi, or when I apologized profusely for spilling a drop of water. But Arthur was patient. He never told me to get over it. He just waited. He stood beside me until the panic subsided, a silent sentinel proving that I was safe. Isabella was the other pillar of my new temple. It would have been easy for her to hate me. I was the reason her wedding was ruined. I was the reason her fiancé was in prison. But Isabella was not like Julian. She had a heart that was actually functional. She visited me often. We did not talk about Julian. We talked about art. We talked about fashion. She taught me how to navigate the shark tank of high society, how to distinguish between a fake friend and a real ally, how to walk into a ballroom and own the space without saying a word. You know, she told me one afternoon as we sat on the terrace of the Newport estate, watching the sailboats, "I think you saved me more than you saved yourself. If I had married him, if I had found out 10 years later, you would have survived." I said, "You are tougher than you look." "Isabella," she laughed, clinking her glass of iced tea against mine. "Maybe, but I prefer this version of survival, the one where we are the ones calling the shots." And we were. I did not want to be a socialite who lunched and shopped. I had spent 20 years working 18-hour days. Idleness felt like a sin. I needed a purpose. I found it in the very skills Martha had exploited. I knew logistics. I knew how to organize chaos. I knew how to manage inventory, schedules, and disparate pieces of information. I had run a mansion on pennies. Imagine what I could do with millions. I took over the philanthropic arm of Sterling Biotech, but I redirected its focus. I founded the Amberton Sterling Initiative. Our mission was specific. We provided resources, private investigators, and advanced DNA technology to help families find missing children. I used my background to streamline the search processes. I worked with the same private intelligence firms Arthur had used. I sat in boardrooms with police chiefs and tech giants, and I did not serve them coffee. I gave them orders. When I spoke about the pain of a lost child, the room listened. When I spoke about the resilience of the survivors, they took notes. I wasn't just a figurehead. I was the proof of concept. 5 years after the wedding that never happened, I stood in the master bedroom of my own apartment in Manhattan. It was the penthouse, overlooking the park. I was getting ready for the annual gala of the initiative. I stood in front of the floor-to-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was 30 years old. She was wearing a tuxedo, a sharp, black Yves Saint Laurent suit with a silk lapel. It was powerful. It was elegant. It was nothing like the frilly, shapeless dresses Martha had forced me to wear. I adjusted the cuffs of my white shirt. I looked at my hands. The scars from the burns were still there, faint white lines against the skin. I did not cover them with makeup. They were my map. They showed where I had been. I looked at my face. The fear was gone. The shadows under the eyes were gone. The gray eyes were clear, sharp, and commanding. For a second, the image in the mirror flickered. I saw the ghost. I saw the 24-year-old girl in the gray rag, holding a scrubbing brush. Her shoulders hunched, her spirit crushed. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked at her. I smiled. It was a gentle smile, a smile of forgiveness. "You can rest now," I whispered to the reflection. "I have got it from here." The ghost blinked, and then she dissolved. She faded into the glass, leaving only Vivian Sterling standing tall in her power suit. I turned away from the mirror. I picked up my clutch. I walked out of the bedroom, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a rhythm that sounded like victory. Arthur was waiting for me in the living room. He stood up when I entered. "You look dangerous," he said, pride beaming from his face. "I am dangerous, Dad," I said, taking his arm. "I am a woman who knows exactly what she is worth." We walked to the elevator. The doors opened. We stepped in. As the doors closed, sealing us in the golden light, I thought about the Kensingtons. I thought about the attic. I thought about the years of silence. They had tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. They had tried to break me, but they had only forged me into steel. They wanted me to bow my head and serve. So I did. I bowed my head. I bowed my head just long enough to tie my laces, ensuring my footing was solid, before I stood up and kicked them out of my life forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey of pain, justice, and ultimate redemption, and I hope you felt every moment of it. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy city, a quiet room, or maybe while you are working hard on your own dreams? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed Vivian's victory, please subscribe to the channel Blue Payback, hit that like button, and press the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us. Stay strong, and never let anyone write your story for you.